He had not spoken first in 3 years. Not once. Every doctor assigned to him had spoken. Every specialist had asked their questions. Every man in that compound had delivered their reports into the silence he kept around himself like armor. Dominic Reeves sat at the head of a $20 million empire. Salt and pepper hair, tailored navy suit, tattoos on hands that rested flat on the table. And he had not initiated a single conversation since the night the darkness came. Because speaking first was an act of need. And Dominic Reeves did not need anything. He commanded it. That was what everyone in that compound believed. That was the story his guards told, the story his rivals feared, the story his organization held together with. A blind king is still a king. He hears everything. He knows everything. Nobody moves on him, because nobody is certain what he still controls from inside that darkness. And so the compound stayed locked. The inner rooms stayed sealed. 2 guards at every entrance, Lucas Vane on the left, Silas Creed on the right, stood at their posts the way men stand when they're protecting something they're also afraid of. No outsiders. No unnecessary access. No one assigned to his personal care lasted more than a few weeks before they were quietly replaced. For 3 years, nothing changed. Then she arrived, a young black nurse in white scrubs, carrying a medical bag and 3 months of unpaid hospital bills in the back of her mind. She was not impressive. She was not connected. She had no reason to be here except the agency's last-minute assignment and the fact that she needed this job more than she needed to be safe. She did not slow down at the gate. She did not flinch at the guards. She walked into that dim, gold-lit room like someone who had already decided how the next hour was going to go. And the moment her voice entered that room, the blind Mafia boss turned his head toward her. Not toward the door. Toward her. Precisely, deliberately, with the focused attention of a man whose remaining senses had spent 3 years sharpening themselves into something close to a weapon. He did not speak. He did not move his hands. But his face turned, and stayed turned, tracking her voice the way a man tracks something he has been waiting a long time to hear. Then he did something he had not done with a single person assigned to him in 3 years. He reached his hand toward her. Not a command, not a dismissal, a reach. Tentative, controlled, almost involuntary, as if some part of him moved before the rest of him could decide not to. The guards in the doorway looked at each other. In 3 years, he had never done that, because she was not just a nurse given a last-minute assignment. She was about to become the only person in that building telling him the truth. The gate opened too smoothly for a private residence. That was the first wrong thing. Private gates hesitate. They groan. They give the person entering a moment to reconsider. This gate opened before the car had fully stopped. Automatic, pre-instructed, expected. The way gates open when the people inside have already decided whether you're useful to them. Chika Ogbonna stepped out into a driveway that had no business being attached to a care assignment. She had been given an address. She had not been given a description. The address had suggested a private residence. The residence suggested something else entirely. A long stone approach, dark oak exterior, warm amber light visible through windows that were too high and too narrow to see through from outside. Deliberate. Every detail of this building was deliberate. She adjusted the strap of her medical bag and walked toward the entrance. 2 men stepped out before she reached the door. Black suits. No visible ID. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. It's controlled. The one on the right spoke. This is a private property. Chika reached into her bag and produced her nursing credentials and the agency assignment form without breaking her stride. I'm the assigned care nurse. Chika Ogbonna. The man took the documents. Studied them longer than necessary. Studied her. You're a replacement. I was told someone was needed. I'm here. He spoke into a radio at his shoulder. A pause. Then a voice she couldn't quite read. Bring her in. The door opened. The interior was not what a care environment looked like. It was what power looked like when it had been living in the same building for a long time and stopped bothering to hide itself. Dark wooden walls. Heavy furniture. Warm, golden light from fittings positioned too high to change without a ladder. The kind of lighting chosen not for function, but for atmosphere, to make everything in the room feel weighty and permanent. No medical equipment visible in the entrance. No clinical signage. No indication that the man living here required care at all. Chika followed the guard down a corridor that felt shorter than it was. He stopped outside a set of double doors. Don't touch him without announcing yourself first. A beat. Don't touch anything in the room without his permission. Don't ask about his eyes. Another beat, this one longer. Don't say anything that isn't directly related to why you're here. She looked at him. Is there anything else? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he opened the door. The room was dim and warm and very quiet. A long oak table dominated the center. One chair, and in it, completely, deliberately still, sat Dominic Reeves. Even seated, he was the kind of man a room arranged itself around. Sharp jawline, lightly weathered skin, salt and pepper hair that had been styled with the precision of someone who still insisted on appearances despite everything. A navy blue suit that had not been bought for comfort. His hands rested flat on the table. She could see the faint trace of tattoos across his fingers, fine lines of ink that suggested a history his suit was designed to make people forget. A dark silk blindfold was tied smoothly across his eyes. His posture was perfectly upright. Whatever the blindness had taken from him, it had not taken that. Chika set her bag down on the side table, opened it, began reviewing the medication list she had been handed at the agency without comment. Good morning, she said it the way she said it to every patient, without performance, without the particular brightness people adopted when they were nervous. My name is Chika Ogbonna. I've been assigned to your care. Nothing. She uncapped her pen and made note. I'll be taking your vitals first, then reviewing your current prescription schedule. If you have a preference for how I work, I'm happy to hear it. Still nothing. In the doorway, the guard on the right watched. He leaned slightly toward the other and said, just below a whisper, she's talking to him like he's going to answer. The other one didn't look away from the room. They always do at first. Chika did not look up. I should tell you that I don't adjust well to silence. She crossed to his side of the table, keeping her footsteps deliberate so he could track her approach. Not because it bothers me, because I tend to feel it. She opened her bag and removed the blood pressure cuff. So if you'd prefer I work quietly, now will be the time to say so. She reached toward his left arm. He turned his head, not toward the door, not toward the sound of her bag, toward her, toward exactly where she was standing, with a precision that made the pen stop moving in her hand. His face had not moved once since she entered the room. Now it was turned directly toward her, the silk blindfold giving nothing away. His expression held in the careful arrangement of a man who has spent 3 years making sure no one can read what crosses his face. But his right hand had lifted slightly from the table. Not a gesture, not a command, just lifted, toward her voice, toward where she stood. Chika held her position for exactly one breath. Then, quietly, in the register of someone speaking to a person who is fully present and fully aware, she said, there you are. In the doorway, when the guard straightened. Dominic Reeves' hand did not move back to the table. The compound breathed differently at night. Dominic had noticed this in the first weeks after the darkness came. The way the building changed its sounds after midnight. The way footsteps slowed, doors sealed with less urgency. Voices dropped to registers people believed he couldn't reach. He had spent 3 years listening to those changes. 3 years cataloging them the way a cartographer maps territory he cannot visit in person, methodically, without sentiment, building a picture from what he could hear rather than what he could see. He knew, for instance, that the East Corridor was used for conversations that weren't meant for him. He knew the difference between the silence that followed a routine update and the silence that followed news someone had decided to manage before it reached him. He knew that managed silence had a particular quality, a fraction too long, a fraction too steady, and that the men who produced it believed he couldn't tell. He could always tell. The empire had not stopped moving when his sight did. That was the lie everyone around him seemed to need, that a blind man at the center of an organization was the same as a blind man at its edge, cut off and safely ignorable. His rivals believed it. Some of his own men had begun to believe it. The city believed it. $20 million in holdings, 6 active operations across 3 states. And the prevailing assumption was that Dominic Reeves was managing it on memory and reputation alone. He was managing it on something sharper than memory. He was managing it on everything they said when they thought he wasn't processing it. Lucas Vane entered the room at 7:15 exactly. Dominic knew his footstep before the door finished opening. A measured pace, slightly heavier on the right, the particular rhythm of a man who had spent years trying to move quietly and never quite mastered it. Lucas was the kind of loyal that asked no questions, which made him useful and, in one specific way, dangerous. A man who asks no questions is a man who cannot warn you about the answers he isn't collecting. Morning report. Lucas set something on the side table, paper by the sound of it. Western distribution is running behind. 2 days. Corrigan says weather. Corrigan always says weather. Yes. What does weather say? A pause that was exactly the length of a man recalculating. I'll follow up. Do that. Lucas left. His footstep retreated down the corridor and did not slow near the east wing. That meant nothing this morning had been worth rerouting. Dominic noted it without expression and turned his attention to the room. Silas Creed came later, 40 minutes later, which was itself a kind of information. Silas moved differently from Lucas. Where Lucas was heavy and earnest, Silas was precise. Every step placed, every pause considered. He was the kind of man who understood that how you enter a room tells the person inside it something, and who had spent years ensuring that what he told was exactly what he intended. It was a skill Dominic had once admired. Eastern Contact wants a meeting. Silas's voice was even, mid-register, practiced. I've suggested end of the week. Neutral location. Which contact? Harlan. Harlan doesn't request meetings. Harlan sends intermediaries. A beat. So either Harlan is frightened, or someone told him I wouldn't notice the difference. Another silence. This one was the managed kind. I'll clarify the request, Silas said. Yes, Dominic said. You do that. Silas left. Dominic sat for a long moment in the quiet after his footstep disappeared. The compound settled around him, warm, expensive, suffocating in the way that all sealed things eventually become suffocating, no matter the quality of their construction. Outside, somewhere beyond the gates, his empire was moving. Decisions were being made in his name. Figures were being shifted. Alignments were being adjusted by fractions he was not being shown. He had been counting those fractions for a year. He had a number now. He knew the shape of the betrayal. He knew its approximate size and its approximate cost. What he did not yet have was confirmation from someone who had no reason to lie to him. That was the only piece still missing. He folded his hands on the table and waited. The agency had called at 6:10 in the morning. Chika had been awake since 5, not by choice, but because the hospital billing department sent automated reminders at the same time every day, and she had not yet found a way to silence them that didn't also silence her alarm. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and her mother's latest treatment summary when the call came. A private care placement. Immediate start. The previous nurse had resigned. She had not asked why. She needed the work. She arrived at the compound at 8:45 with a medical bag, an agency form, and the particular quality of tiredness that sits behind the eyes and does not lift regardless of how much sleep surrounds it. The gate, the driveway, the 2 men waiting at the door, none of it registered as threat. It registered as context, a new environment with its own particular rules and its own particular atmosphere, the same as every placement before this one. The guard on the right looked at her the way certain men looked at women who arrived somewhere they weren't expected. Not hostility exactly, but the pointed absence of welcome. He took her credentials without asking for them, which meant he had already been told to expect documents. He studied them for longer than necessary anyway. You're the replacement. He handed the forms back without looking at her. Yes. You know the rules for this assignment? I was given a briefing sheet. The briefing sheet is a summary. He stepped slightly closer, not enough to be physical, just enough to require her to hold her ground. The full version is, you don't ask questions that aren't clinical. You don't speak to him about anything outside your scope. You don't discuss what you see in this building with anyone outside it. A pause. The last nurse found those terms difficult. Chika met his eyes. Where is she now? Something crossed his face that was not quite an answer. She resigned. He said it the way people said things that were meant to end conversations, and then he opened the door. The room was exactly as she had left it the previous day, warm, dim, deliberately still, the amber light making everything feel amber, including the man seated at the table. Dominic had not moved from the position she'd found him in during her orientation visit. She understood now that this was not coincidence. This was how he occupied space, completely without waste. She set her bag on the side table, opened it, removed the blood pressure cuff and a medication checklist and a pen that had seen better days. "Good morning," she said it without ceremony, without the particular brightness of someone performing calm. "I'll start with vitals and then review your morning medications." No response. She uncapped the pen, made a note, moved to his side of the table, footsteps deliberate so he could track her. She reached down and lifted his left wrist. He went completely still, not the stillness of the past few minutes that had been chosen, controlled, settled. This was a different kind. The stillness of a system that has encountered something outside its parameters and stopped to process it. His hand did not pull away. His posture did not shift. But every other movement in the room seemed to suspend itself around him. Chika found his pulse and counted. Steady, slightly elevated. She made another note and set his wrist gently back on the table. From the doorway, one of the guards spoke, his voice tight. "You're supposed to announce before you touch him." She looked up. "It's a pulse check. I announced my name and my intention when I entered. That's not the protocol. I wasn't given that protocol." She turned back to her checklist. "I'll know for tomorrow." The guard said nothing more. At the table, Dominic's hands had returned to their flat, considered resting position. But his face had turned, just slightly, just enough, in her direction. The same precise, involuntary turn as the morning before. Nobody touched him without announcement. Nobody had failed to apologize for it either. Until now. The medication room was small and windowless and smelled like every medication room she had ever worked in. Antiseptic and aluminum and the particular stillness of a space that only existed to be functional. A single counter, a locked cabinet, a laminated sheet of protocols taped to the inside of the door that someone had printed years ago and never updated. Chika had been given the cabinet key on her second morning. Routine. She had signed for it, noted it, and filed it with the rest of the assignment paperwork in the folder she kept in the outer pocket of her bag. Also routine. This was how private placements worked. Incrementally, access given in small portions until the household decided you were predictable enough to trust with the next portion. She pulled the daily compound from the cabinet at 8:53 and set it on the counter. The prescription form was clipped to the front of the patient file, the same as always. She cross-referenced it the same way she cross-referenced every medication on every assignment. Not because she expected a problem, but because the habit had been trained in her so thoroughly in her second year of nursing school that she no longer experienced it as a choice. Read the label. Match it to the prescription. Confirm the dosage. Initial the log. She read the label. Then she read the prescription. Then she read the label again. The compound name was close. Close enough that someone reading quickly, or reading without a pharmacological background, or reading while managing for other tasks, would not have caught it. 2 letters transposed in the suffix. A formulation number that didn't correspond to anything in the standard therapeutic index for ocular nerve treatment. She knew this because she had spent 8 months on a neurology ward 3 years ago and had cross-referenced enough vision-related compounds to recognize the shape of the ones that didn't belong. She set the bottle down, picked it up again, read a third time. The base chemical was not a treatment compound. It was a suppressant, a slow-acting agent developed for experimental use in neurological research trials that had been discontinued in clinical settings for almost a decade. She had seen a paper on it once, in a journal she'd been assigned during her placement. The paper's conclusion had been unambiguous. Prolonged administration causes progressive and cumulative optic nerve suppression, reversible in early stages. After 18 months, the reversal window narrowed significantly. After 36, her hand stopped moving. She turned the bottle over, found the dispensing label on the base. A pharmacy she didn't recognize. A prescribing physician whose name she would later search and find no registration for. And a refill record, a small strip of adhesive dates along the side of the label, the kind some compounding pharmacies use to track recurring orders. 36 months of consecutive refills. She put the bottle back on the counter, carefully, with the particular care of someone who has realized that the way they handle the next 30 seconds matters. Outside the medication room, the compound continued its ordinary morning. Footsteps in the corridor, the low exchange of a guard rotation. Somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and closed. Chika annealed the log, prepared the decanted dose, finished the rest of the medication tray in the correct sequence. She returned the compound to the cabinet, locked it, and clipped her pen to the front of the folder. She completed the rest of her shift without deviation. She said goodbye to no one in particular at the gate. She drove the 40 minutes home with the radio off. She made dinner she didn't eat. She called her mother, listened to the update about the treatment schedule, said the right things. She washed her cup and turned off the kitchen light. Then she lay down on her bed and looked at the ceiling. The compound had been running for 36 months, which meant the darkness had not arrived the night of the chemical attack. The darkness had been delivered every morning by someone with a key to that cabinet and a reason to keep the most dangerous man she had ever sat beside unable to see. She lay there for a long time. She did not sleep. She made the decision at 4 a.m, not with drama, not after a long internal deliberation that arrived at a principled conclusion. She made it the way exhausted people make decisions that will change their lives, quietly, in the dark, because the alternative had become something she could no longer hold in her body without it costing her something she couldn't afford to lose. She knew the correct prescription. She had the pharmacological knowledge to source the appropriate compound through legitimate clinical channels. She had the agency credentials to place the order without it appearing irregular. And she had the cabinet key. The rest was just execution. She made no record of the swap. She decanted the correct compound into a dispensing vessel that matched the original in volume and color, close enough that a routine glance would register nothing different. She annealed the log the same way she always annealed it. She returned the original bottle to the back of the cabinet where the refill dates faced the wall. She did all of this on the 4th morning. Then she prepared the tray and carried it to the main room as though the previous 3 days had not happened. By the 7th day, she noticed a change before he named it. His posture was the same, controlled, deliberate, assembled with the precision of a man who had spent 3 years ensuring that nothing about his body communicated limitation. But the particular tension that had lived in his jaw and the space between his brows had eased by a fraction, small enough that someone who hadn't been watching would have missed it. She had been watching. On the 8th day, he spoke to her differently. "How long have you worked in private care?" The question arrived during a routine blood pressure check, delivered in the same, even register he used for everything. Casual in construction, not casual in intent. "About 2 years. She released the cuff. "Mostly post-surgical. Some neurological. Neurological. A beat. What draws someone to that? The complexity." She made a note. "Most things in the body are mechanical. Neurology is more like interpretation. The same symptom can mean entirely different things depending on what's upstream of it." He said nothing for a moment. Upstream. The source. What's causing the presenting condition versus what the presenting condition looks like on its own. Another pause, the kind that had weight in it. And when the source isn't what everyone has assumed it is. She looked up. His face was turned toward her at the angle he always used. Not quite profile, not quite forward, the positioning of a man who was listening with his whole body. She could not tell, from this angle, whether the question was general or specific. "Then the treatment changes," she said carefully. "Everything changes." He said nothing more. She finished the check and packed the tray. At the door, she was aware of Silas Creed in the corridor before she saw him. That was new. He had always been present in the building. She had cataloged his footstep in the same peripheral way she cataloged all the rhythms of the compound, but his proximity to the medication room had increased in the past 3 days. Not obviously, not in a way that could be named or reported. He simply appeared near spaces she had recently occupied, in a way that a careful man inserted himself into someone's periphery without ever making direct contact. He looked at her now with the expression of someone who had not yet decided what she was. She nodded once and walked past him. Back in the medication room, she locked the cabinet and stood with her hands flat on the counter for a moment. Her pulse was steady. She noted this with the same clinical detachment she brought to everything, as information, as data, as something to be logged and managed. What she did not note, because there was no column in any log for it, was what had moved through her when Dominic asked about the source. He had not been making conversation. He had already known. The swap had not told him something new. It had confirmed something he had been carrying alone in the dark for longer than she had worked in this building. He had been waiting for someone to find what she found. He had been waiting to see what they would do with it. The compound was quieter at 7 in the evening than at any other hour. The day shift had rotated out. The night rotation had taken their positions, but not yet settled into them. There was a transitional stillness between the two that lasted approximately 12 minutes. A window Chika had mapped without intending to, simply by being present at the end of enough shifts to notice that the building exhaled in those minutes before it resealed itself for the night. She had stayed late to update the medication log. That was what she would have said if anyone asked. No one asked. The main room held only the amber light and Dominic and the particular silence that had come to feel over the past 2 weeks, less like absence and more like atmosphere. Something the room produced rather than simply contained. He was at the table, hands flat, face forward, the silk blindfold smooth across his eyes. She sat down across from him, not beside him, where she usually positioned herself for clinical tasks. Across from him, at the table, as a person sits when they intend to speak rather than work. He registered the difference immediately. She had learned to expect that. The silence held for a moment. Then he asked it. What did you change? Not a question in its inflection. A statement with a space left at the end of it for her to fill. She had rehearsed several versions of this conversation over the past week. All of them had involved more preamble, more clinical framing, more careful architecture around the central fact to make it easier to receive. She discarded all of them now. Your blindness wasn't caused by the attack. She kept her voice level. It's been maintained chemically. The compound you've been administered every morning for the past 3 years is a vision-suppressing agent. It isn't treating anything. It's the source of the condition. A pause. I replaced it 11 days ago with the correct prescription. The room did not change. Dominic did not move, did not shift his weight, did not alter the angle of his face or the position of his hands or the quality of his stillness in any way she could identify. If the words had landed, they landed somewhere beneath the surface of him, somewhere deep enough that nothing reached the exterior. The silence stretched to 10 seconds. 15. Then, who knows you found this? No one. Another silence. Shorter this time. Keep it that way. His voice carried the same register it always carried, even controlled, calibrated. Come back tomorrow. She held his gaze for a moment, or what passed for his gaze. The dark silk, the face behind it, the absolute composure of a man who had just been handed the most significant information of the past 3 years and chosen stillness as his response. Then she packed her bag, annealed the last line of the log, walked to the door. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard nothing. No movement, no exhale, no sound of a man reacting to what he had just been told. She walked to her car in the dark and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. He remained at the table for a long time after her footsteps left the corridor. The compound settled around him, expensive, sealed, warm with the particular warmth of a building that had never needed to be comfortable, only impressive. His empire, his walls, his men at their posts, loyal in the ways they understood loyalty. He had known the name for 4 months. He had assembled it the way he assembled everything now, from fragments, from hesitations, from the specific frequency of a voice that changed slightly when it was managing information rather than delivering it. He had built the picture incrementally, silently, and held it in the dark alongside everything else the dark had given him the patience to accumulate. What he had not had was a source outside the circle. Someone with no position to protect, no allegiance to maintain, no reason in the world to tell him the truth, except that the truth was what it was. Now he had that. He sat with his hands flat on the table and felt something move through him that was not grief and was not fear and was not the cold strategic calculation he had learned to substitute for emotion over the past 3 years. It was older than all of those. It was rage, and unlike the blindness, it was entirely his own. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footstep. Silas moved too carefully for that. It was the quality of the corridor that changed, the way a space changes when someone occupies it with intention. She had her bag over one shoulder and the exit 20 feet ahead when he stepped out of the alcove beside the medication room and positioned himself between her and the rest of the hallway. Not blocking, simply present. A man who understood that physical obstruction was a crude instrument and that proximity, correctly deployed, communicated everything obstruction did without requiring a single aggressive gesture. Long shift, he said. Routine. She kept her voice even. Medication log runs long on Thursdays. Does it? He fell in a step beside her. Not behind, not in front. Beside, at a distance that was just close enough to be deliberate. I've been meaning to speak with you. She did not answer. She kept walking at the same pace she had been walking. The nurse before you, Silas said. Did anyone tell you much about her? I was told she resigned. That's right. A pause that contained something he was allowing her to hear. She was thorough, detail-oriented, very professional by all accounts. Another pause. She started asking questions that weren't part of her clinical scope. About the medications, the sourcing, the prescribing physician. He let that settle for exactly the right number of steps. She resigned quite suddenly after that. We haven't been able to reach her since. The exit was 10 feet away. I mention it, he continued, because I've noticed you're all so thorough, detail-oriented. His voice carried no heat, no edge, nothing that could be named or reported or held up as evidence of anything. It was the voice of a man having an ordinary conversation. I think that's admirable. The right nurse notices things, addresses what's within her scope, doesn't carry concerns outside the compound that are better handled internally. She pushed through the exterior door. The night air was cold and immediate, and she drew it in without breaking her stride. Silas followed her as far as the threshold. No further. When she reached the third step down, he spoke again, and she stopped without meaning to. Stop the way you stop when something in your body decides to before your mind is caught up. Your mother is at St. Augustine's. Ward C, second floor. The treatment's expensive. A beat, warm, and ruinous. I hope the placement is working out well for you financially. She did not turn around. You're a good nurse. His voice carried the particular gentleness of someone who wanted her to understand that gentleness was a choice he was making, and that choices could be unmade. Stay that way. The door closed behind him. The walk to her car was 32 steps. She counted them without deciding to. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands in her lap and her bag on the passenger seat, and the engine off for longer than she later remembered, looking at a fixed point on the dashboard that wasn't anything. Then she took out her phone and called her mother. The call lasted 11 minutes. Her mother talked about the nurses on Ward C and the quality of the afternoon meals and a television program she had discovered. Chika said the right things. She said them steadily, at the correct intervals, with the correct warmth. She said goodnight. She sat in the car for a while longer after that. She did not sleep when she got home. She did not expect to. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let the shape of what Silas had said move through her completely. The nurse who never came home, the ward and the floor number, the address he hadn't needed to say out loud because the hospital had already said enough. She was afraid. She wanted to be precise about that. She was genuinely, physically afraid. In the morning, she got up. She made coffee. She drove to the compound. She was 12 minutes early. In the east corridor, in the alcove beside the medication room, Lucas Vane stood in the dark where he had been standing since before Silas moved. He had heard every word. He did not follow Chika to the door. He did not intercept Silas on his way back through the corridor. He stood very still for a long moment with his eyes on the middle distance and something rearranging itself quietly behind his expression. Then he went back to his post. He said nothing. Yet, He told her on a Tuesday. Not with urgency. Not as an announcement. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, at the end of something else, as though the information was simply the next item in an ordered sequence. There's light at the left edge of my vision. Chika set down the temperature gauge. Since when? 4 days ago. It was diffuse at first. Now it has definition. A pause. The outline of the window. The shape of the lamp. She moved to his left side without being asked and ran a brief assessment. Tracking response, light sensitivity, the quality of what he described when she asked him to characterize it. She asked her questions in the same, even register she used for everything. He answered with the same precision he brought to every exchange. Between them, the clinical process held its shape, and inside that shape something else was also happening, something neither of them addressed directly. It's consistent with the reversal profile, she said finally. The suppression compound clears from the optic pathway incrementally. If the damage hasn't progressed past a certain threshold, the nerve can begin to restore. And if it has, then the recovery is partial. She met the blindfold, met the space behind it, the habit of it. We won't know the ceiling until the clearing is further along. He nodded once. Tell no one. I know. She knew because he hadn't needed to say it the first time either. The early mornings became theirs without either of them deciding that. The 12-minute window between shift rotations, the amber light still dim before the household fully woke, the table between them quiet and unhurried. She came early. He was always already there. She didn't ask whether he slept in the chair or arrived from somewhere else. It wasn't within her clinical scope, and they had both quietly agreed, without discussing it, to let that boundary do some of the work that would otherwise need to be done with words. On the third morning, he asked her how she had come to nursing. She looked up from the log. That isn't a clinical question. No, he said. It isn't. The straightforwardness of it caught her somewhere between the sternum and the throat. In 3 weeks inside this building, no one had asked her a single thing about herself that wasn't procedural. Not her hours, not her preferences, not her name pronounced with any real attention. She had existed here as function, a role, a credential, a replacement for someone who asked too many questions and disappeared. My mother was ill when I was 19, she said. Not the way she's ill now. Different. We didn't have the right help for a long time. When she finally had someone who knew what they were looking at, everything changed within a week. She paused. I wanted to be the person who knew what they were looking at. Dominic said nothing for a moment. The lamp cast its amber light across the table between them, across his hands, across the tattoos she had stopped noticing as dangerous and started noticing as detail. And do you, he said, generally, know what you're looking at? She considered the question with the seriousness it was given. More often than people expect. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. His face didn't do that yet. Or perhaps had simply not done it in so long that the surrounding muscles had forgotten the architecture. But something moved. Brief, almost involuntary. Yes, he said quietly. I imagine so. The rotation would change in 4 minutes. She capped her pen. Same time tomorrow, she said. He inclined his head. She gathered her bag and left him there in the warm amber dark. In a room where the window outline had begun to separate itself from shadow, where the lamp was becoming a shape with edges, where 3 years of cultivated blindness were pulling back, incrementally, like a tide. Behind the baseboard on the east wall, at the junction of 2 panels where the gap was wide enough to accept a small device and no wider, a transmitter the size of a thumbnail recorded the silence after she left. It recorded everything before it, too. It had been there for 11 days. It came back fully on a Wednesday. Not gradually, the way the previous weeks had moved. The edge of the window, the shape of the lamp, the slow territorial expansion of light into darkness. This was different. This was the last wall coming down. He was aware of it the moment he woke. A completeness where incompleteness had been. The room assembled around him in full rather than partial detail. Every surface and shadow present and correctly positioned. He lay still for a long time before he moved. Then he sat up and looked at his hands and looked at the room, and looked at the window where the early light was coming through at the angle he had mapped in the dark for memory and heat, and the particular way it warmed the left side of his face between 7 and 7:30. He had the geometry exactly right. He straightened his collar, settled his expression, put the blindfold back in place, and sat down at the table to wait. She arrived at 7:14. He heard her come through the gate, heard the particular rhythm of her footstep in the corridor, heard the door open in the way she always opened it, with her shoulder because both hands were usually carrying something. He had the whole of her mapped in sound. He knew the pace she kept when the morning had been difficult and the pace she kept when it hadn't. He knew the small adjustment she made to her bag strap when she was tired. He knew the half second she gave herself before she spoke, the breath she took that wasn't quite a sigh. He watched her set the bag down without turning his face toward her. He let her work. She changed the dressing on his right forearm, a residual wound from 3 years ago, healing slowly the way things healed when the body was managing other demands. Her hands moved with the efficiency he had cataloged in the dark, deliberate, unhurried, no wasted motion. He watched her now, the careful peel of the old dressing, the inspection, the clean application. Hands that had made a choice 11 days into an assignment that could have cost her everything and had simply made it anyway, without announcement, without requesting credit. He looked at her face. The tiredness behind her eyes was the kind that accumulated rather than arrived. Layered, long-standing, the specific weight of a person who had been managing more than one life for a long time. Her expression, while she worked, was focused and quiet and contained something he recognized without having a clean word for. The look of a person who had decided, some years ago, to be equal to what was asked of them, regardless of what that cost. She reached for the medical tape. She looked up. She found him looking back, not at the blindfold, at her, through her, with both eyes open and fully present, and trained on her face with the particular directness of a man who had been waiting very patiently for this precise moment. Her hand stopped. The room held itself completely still. He said quietly, "You're younger than I imagined." The medical tape remained in her hand. She did not move for 3 full seconds, not from fear, but from a specific stillness of a person absorbing the full weight of what they are being shown. Then she set the tape down on the table with great care, as though the moment required that kind of care, and looked at him. Just looked at him. There was no announcement, no eruption, no theater of revelation. Only 2 people in an amber-lit room, one of them seeing the other for the first time, and the thing that moved between them in that silence needing no words to be entirely understood. "How long?" she said. "This morning." Fully. A pause. The edge of the window. 3 weeks ago. She nodded once, picked up the tape, finished the dressing. Her hands were steady. The door opened 2 minutes later. Silas Creed entered with a morning report in his hand and a sentence already formed. He crossed the threshold, looked up from the papers, and stopped. Dominic had not replaced the blindfold. He was sitting at the table in full light with both eyes open, and those eyes moved immediately, fluidly, without hesitation, from the papers in Silas's hand to Silas's face. Tracking, focusing, seeing. The morning report lowered by a fraction. In the 3 seconds that followed, something passed through Silas Creed's expression that was not fear in the ordinary sense. Fear required uncertainty, and there was no uncertainty left in this room. It was the look of a man who had spent 3 years running a calculation that had just reached its final line. The answer was not in his favor. He knew, in those 3 seconds, exactly how much time he had left. It was not very much. Silas left the room without a word. That in itself was information. In 3 years of morning reports, Silas had never left a room without completing the exchange he had entered it to complete. He was too precise for unfinished business. The fact that he crossed the threshold, turned left into the corridor, and did not stop meant that he had immediately begun the calculation Dominic knew he would begin. How much time, which assets, which exit, which call to make first. Dominic gave him 40 seconds. He knew Silas's pace. He had mapped it in the dark across months of careful, unhurried listening. 40 seconds to reach the east corridor. Another 15 to confirm the morning rotation was still positioned away from the wing. Then the phone. He looked at Chika. Stay in this room. She met his eyes, still adjusting to being met by them, still recalibrating every exchange for this new variable, him seeing her, actually seeing her, and nodded once without asking questions. He walked out. Silas had his phone in his hand by the time he reached the East Corridor junction. He had not called yet. He was the kind of man who constructed the sentence before he dialed, who never began a communication without knowing how it ended. He stood at the junction with his thumb over the screen and his back to the alcove and did not hear the person in it until he turned. Lucas Vane was standing in front of the door. Not at the door, the way a guard stands at a post. In front of it, squarely, with both feet settled and his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and is no longer in the process of making it. Silas looked at him. Move. Lucas said nothing. I said move. Silas's voice carried the precise calibration of a man accustomed to being obeyed, even authoritative, with the specific weight of someone who had spent 3 years issuing instructions that mattered. Stand aside, Lucas. That's a direct order. Lucas looked at him with an expression that was not hostile and was not conflicted and was not performing anything at all. It was the expression of a man who had been in the alcove when Silas spoke to Chika about her mother's ward, who had heard the name of the nurse before Chika, who had stopped asking questions, who had been standing in corridors and carrying orders for 3 years without asking what the orders were for, and who had arrived quietly and without announcement at the point where asking no longer felt like loyalty. He did not move. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there in front of the door with the solid and immovable quality of a man who has finally put his weight somewhere and intends to leave it. Silas understood, not the decision. He had not anticipated Lucas, which was its own kind of information about how thoroughly he had underestimated the people around him. But the shift. He understood the shift. It had already happened, in some room he hadn't been watching, at some point he hadn't been present for. The architecture of the moment had changed while he was managing other parts of the building. He was still holding the phone when Dominic came around the corridor. No blindfold. Both eyes open. Walking at the unhurried pace of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been heading for a very long time and found no reason to rush the final steps. He stopped in front of Silas. He looked at him fully, directly, with 3 years of accumulated dark behind his eyes and the morning light in the corridor and the absolute composure of a man who had already decided every part of what came next. Silas did not speak. Dominic said, "How much did you make?" The question arrived in the same, even register as every other thing he said. No heat, no theater, just a question placed in the corridor between them like an object on a table. Silas held his gaze for a moment. He was too precise a man to calculate quickly under that kind of looking. He arrived at a number, the real number, not a managed one, because something in the quality of being seen, truly seen, after 3 years of operating behind a blindfold, made the managed number feel not merely dishonest, but structurally impossible. He said it. Dominic listened to the number. He did not react to it visibly. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, into the dark interior of a man who processed information privately and completely before allowing any of it to reach his face. Then he looked at Lucas. A single look, brief and complete. Lucas opened the door. She submitted the resignation on a Thursday. 1 page. Agency letterhead. The standard language of a placement concluded with the standard notice period waived by mutual agreement. She had written it the night before at her kitchen table, in the same chair where she had sat with cold coffee and her mother's billing summary the morning the agency called. The symmetry of it was not lost on her. Everything had begun here. It was reasonable that it should end here too. She arrived at the compound at 8:30 to return the cabinet key and the signed copy of the termination form. The gate opened. The driveway was quiet. The 2 men at the door were different from the ones who had been there on her first morning, which was its own small signal about how thoroughly the past week had rearranged the compound's interior architecture. She handed the key to the duty attendant, signed the form, picked up her bag. She had known about her mother's bills since 6:17 that morning, when she had logged into the patient portal out of habit and found a zero balance where the accumulated total had been for the past 14 months. Fully cleared. No payment plan, no partial credit, no administrative note explaining the source. Simply gone, overnight, with the clean finality of a decision made by someone who did not require acknowledgement. She had sat with her phone in her hands for a long time. Then she had finished getting dressed and driven to the compound to return the key. She was at the front door, bag over one shoulder, the morning light coming in flat and gray behind her, when his voice reached her from the end of the corridor. Chika, not nurse, not the replacement, not the woman from the agency, or any of the other functional designations the building had assigned her across 5 weeks of mornings. Her name, both syllables, the emphasis correctly placed in the precise position it sat in her mother's mouth and her own and no one else's inside this building, or so she had assumed, until now. She stopped. She turned. He was standing at the far end of the corridor in full light, without the blindfold, without the assembled armor of the table and the amber dark and the careful staging of a man managing his own vulnerability. He was simply standing there, both eyes open, looking at her with the directness that she had now had 1 week to adjust to and had not yet finished adjusting to. I have my sight back. He said it without preamble, the same way he said everything that mattered. I'd like to use it well. A pause, brief and complete. Stay. The corridor held them at its two ends for a moment. She looked at him, really looked the way she had been looked at and had not yet fully returned, because looking at him directly still required a kind of recalibration she was working through. A man who had built an empire and nearly lost it to the people he kept closest. A man who had spent 3 years in the dark mapping lies by the frequency of voices, waiting for someone from outside the circle with nothing to gain and no reason to tell the truth except that it was the truth. A man who was asking her, now, in a corridor with no theater and no negotiation and no secondary offer, to stay. Not as a nurse. She said yes. Not for the cleared balance, though it had made her cry in a way she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Not for the safety of the compound or the weight of his name or any of the currencies the building ran on. Because she had walked into this room 5 weeks ago and looked at him the way she looked at every patient, as a person entirely, without the distortions of power or reputation or fear, and somewhere in the 5 weeks since he had looked back. That was not nothing. That was, in her experience, quite rare. Later, much later, she asked him how he had learned to say her name correctly. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a man deciding how much of an answer to give. Lucas, he said. She thought of the alcove, the corridor, the shape that had been in the shadows across 5 weeks of mornings she had moved through without knowing she was being watched by someone who was choosing, quietly and without announcement, which side of the door to stand on when it mattered. He told you. He told me from the beginning. A pause. He said I would need to know it. She looked at the window. The light through it was the same amber as the lamp, warmer now, wider. He was right, she said. Dominic said nothing. But something moved in his expression, the same brief, almost involuntary thing she had first seen at the table 6 weeks ago, when she had told him she knew what she was looking at. This time, it stayed a little longer. The most powerful person in a room is not always the loudest, the wealthiest, or the most feared. Sometimes it's the tired woman who showed up anyway. Chika had no title, no connections, no protection. What she had was the courage to see clearly, and the integrity to act on what she saw, even when silence would have been so much safer. Here is what this story quietly teaches. The people who change your life rarely arrive with fanfare. They come in ordinary clothes, carrying ordinary bags, with unpaid bills and sleeping problems and no reason at all to go out of their way for you. But they do it anyway, because that is who they are. And if you're the person in the dark right now, unable to see what's ahead, unsure who to trust, pay attention to the one who tells you the truth when lying would have cost them nothing. That person is worth everything. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Your time means more than you know. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. See you in the next one.